We'll explore contingency planning. Incidents happen all the time. Now, an incident here is when the infrastructure is compromised. By infrastructure, we're talking specifically of the IT infrastructure and the network infrastructure of the company. So these sort of incidents can happen where there is a data breach or a network breach or some sort of a cyber crime, and they can cause service outages and threaten day-to-day operations of the company. Now, when an attack or a breach happens and it's successfully stopped, that still should be treated as an incident. So there are three main groups when you're talking about contingency planning and incidents. There is the incident response, disaster recovery, and the business continuity. Now, incident response is the process of actually preventing and mitigating these kind of attacks and threats. An incident response plan is usually made in order to help create a set of instructions to help the IT staff detect, respond, and recover from any network security type incidents. These type of plans also address the more common courses of action for the incidents that are more likely to happen in that area or depending on the type of the business and so on. The three steps of this is to prepare, detect and analyze, and then provide any post-incident activity, in that case documentation and lessons learned. You can do this by identifying an application's weak spots, hardening the security perimeters against any of the future assaults, and then safeguarding the access to the sensitive parts of an application. Now, the incident response team is a group of people that's assigned to implement the incident response plan. So typically, these are members of the IT staff who collect, preserve, and analyze the incident-related data. This staff may need to work with the actual incident response team members are highly trained. So typically, if an event actually happens or an incident actually occurs, it's the IT tech is usually going to be helping the first responders. So usually, if they're part of the first responders team, so you don't necessarily have to have the subject matter expertise. You don't necessarily have to have the subject matter expertise because some of these topics will require legal knowledge and so on. So as you can see here in the diagram, there are three main groups. There is a command, liaisons, and the operations. So initially in the command, you have the main commander, and if it's a large company, then you have a deputy and a scribe as well. Then you have the liaisons, who actually are sort of like the middle managers, and then you have team leaders, and then you have the subject matter experts for specific areas in order to bring the operations back up to speed. Now, the second part is disaster recovery. So a disaster here is an event that's catastrophic. So a big part of the infrastructure is destroyed, and usually this is caused by, let's say, a tornado, an earthquake, or a flood. Now, similar to the incident response part, disaster recovery also has a disaster recovery plan, and there is a disaster recovery team that needs to be assigned as well. So the plan again will have the more common catastrophic events that may happen in that area, and then the kind of response that has to be taken. So you'll have some sort of a plan on what to do when a disaster happens. So typically, one of the things that you might think of is, even when this COVID or this sort of an incident happens, this is also sort of like a disaster, and there are actually contingency plans and disaster recovery plans for this sort of a thing, and even governments have these kind of plans that are already written and set and prepared for. So that's when they take those out, and then they try to follow those steps only when that kind of catastrophic event actually happens. Now, part of the disaster recovery preparation is taking backups. So if you have backups of all your data, then that would be a pretty useful thing to have in order to recover your company and your business back. So there are different types of backups that you can take. The simplest backup is to just take a full backup periodically. So that's sort of what I do for my personal computer or one of my laptops, where every day at 3 a.m. the entire hard drive gets backed up to an external disk. Now, because this is a personal computer, that's a fine strategy. But if this is for a business, or if there are multiple machines and there is a lot of data, then this is a very costly and inefficient manner of backing up. There are three types of backups. There is the full backup, the incremental, and the differential. The full backup is what we just discussed, where you take every single file and folder and back everything up periodically. Now, when you're doing these type of backups, there is something called an archive bit. So this has been around for a long time, and this is a file attribute which can be turned on and off. So it's a 1 or a 0 or a flag, if you will. So in a full backup, this archive bit is off. Now in an incremental backup, this is when you only copy the files and folders that have changed since the last full or incremental backup. So the way it knows that a file has changed is based on that archive bit, which gets turned on. So once the copy is done and once the backup is done, then the archive bits are set to off. Now in a differential backup, this is where you copy all the files that have been changed since the last full backup. And this doesn't turn off the archive bits. Now, typically most companies do a weekly full backup, and then they do incremental or differential backups every day, usually at the end of the day. The differential backup is a cumulative backup. However, because the archive bits are not set, it keeps backing up all the changes since the last full backup. This means the files would get progressively larger throughout the week. Now with the incremental backup, only the files that have changed since the last full or incremental backup are backed up. So each incremental backup file will be relatively small, and it'll also be very different from the previous backup file. So just to summarize the difference between the incremental and the differential, incremental requires less storage space, but it takes longer to actually restore. With the differential, it requires more storage space, but it's much faster when you're trying to restore from the backup. Now there are some metrics that you can use in order to assess which backup plan is best for you and your business. So there is something called an RPO, which is the recovery point objective. So this is a metric that measures how much data will be lost if a backup is used. So since the last backup, and suddenly if today, at whatever time it is now, let's say it's 5 o'clock, if right now some catastrophe happens and then we need to restore from a backup, so how much data will be lost between the last time data was fully backed up and right now? So that's the RPO. And then the recovery time objective is how long will it take for us to get back to fully restore and back to business. The MTBF is the mean time between failures. This usually applies to hardware components, and it represents the manufacturer's best guess regarding how much time will pass between major failures of that component. So there are a lot of assumptions that go into this, and usually the organizations take the risk factor into account because it may affect the day-to-day operations. Now the MTTR is the mean time to recovery. So this is the amount of time it takes for a hardware component to recover from failure. Now the disaster recovery should handle everything from restoring hardware to backups, but only at the main business location. So anything that's remote or offsite will be handled by the offsite recovery, and that's a separate topic. Now, business continuity planning is, as the name implies, how the business should continue when and if such an event or an incident happens. So how do you get back to operating at full speed, and what sort of remote site or remote operations that we can do in order to actually get the business up and running, at least temporarily, or find some sort of a secondary location that enables the organization to continue operating while the primary site is being rebuilt. The plan on how to make this happen is called the business continuity planning. In terms of the secondary sites, so there are three types of sites. There is the cold, warm, and hot. A cold site is usually a location that consists of a building, facilities, desks, and so on. However, it doesn't have any computers or any of the routers or technology or anything. So it's sort of like just an empty office from where you can continue working. A warm site has some computers which might be loaded with software and have some sort of a local area network, some connection to the internet, some sort of a hardware infrastructure, but in this case you don't actually have the exact data from your own company and so on. So you can think of it as using a co-working space that has computers. So the first one is like a co-working space or an empty office that just has desks, and the second one is sort of like a co-working space that provides you with computers and some sort of infrastructure. And then the hot site is where you actually have all your backups and all your data ready, so you can instantly get back to work, or just in a few hours you can start working. So you can see some of the differences here on what actually is included in the cold, warm, and hot sites. So this sort of a thing actually happened to us once when we were struck with a hurricane back when we were in Florida. So the company actually, after losing power for almost 2 weeks, so after the first week we had to continue doing business, and we had to move a few hours away to a container site where they had a secondary location with just desks and a few computers. So we had to load all our own computers from our office in a truck and move them over there, and then set up the office there, and then be there for like a month or so while the power was back up in our main office. So these sort of things actually do happen, and that's why you need to have some sort of a plan ready before they happen. Now, as part of the business continuity plan, now we can also use the RPO and RTO and actually calculate which areas and which parts of the company should actually get back up to speed, and what are the pros and cons, and what's the cost-effective solution as well, because you don't want to spend too much money on this either, so you have to find the right balance. Forensics. Now, computer forensics is the science of gathering, preserving, and presenting evidence that's stored on a computer or any sort of a digital media. So this is usually needs to be presented in a court of law, and forensics is actually a pretty highly skilled area. Now, within forensics and within computer forensics, there are even separate specializations and certifications and so on. So as a IT tech, you're not required to actually have knowledge of these things, but you will need to have the knowledge to assist someone who's actually working with the forensics. So if a forensics consultant is on site and they need access to certain types of data and so on, then you'll be helping with the first responder, and you should be able to support them in order to get what they need. But at the same time, you also need to make sure that the data is secure, and you're documenting what's actually happening in that scene. You're also collecting evidence, and you're also having some kind of a discussion with the authorities. So just because there is a forensics consultant on site and they're asking for access to all sorts of data, you can't just give it to them, because obviously you might have access to those storage devices and so on, because you might be an administrator. That doesn't automatically grant you to provide them with the data. So you want to make sure that you're documenting what's actually happening, and you're checking with the authorities that it's actually okay and it's authorized to provide that data. Now the final step is the emergency procedures. So having proper emergency procedures in place is useful for obvious reasons, and typically there are 5 aspects that you need to look at. There is the building layout, the fire escape plan, the safety at the emergency exits, the fail open, fail close, and the alert system. The exit plans need to cover things like the building layout, the fire escape plans, and where the emergency exits are. Now, when you have secured areas like the server room and the equipment room and so on, these should have some sort of a default safety mechanisms, so they get automatically locked. So that's where the fail open and the fail close come into play. The locked doors need to fail open. So this means that the doors default to open when there is an emergency. Or the other case is the fail closed, where the doors lock in case of the emergency. And the alert system is pretty much notification systems, which can be a mix of loud noises or an alarm, as well as sending an SMS or a phone call and so on.
For more details, check the link in the description. Learn with Whizlabs. Success certified.